Realm of Hungry Ghosts is brought to us by Dr Gabor Maté and summarises his close encounters with addiction while working as a staff physician at the Portland Hotel located in Vancouver's infamous Downtown Eastside District. It aims to answer questions such as what causes addiction, what it means to have an addiction-prone personality, the concept of choice, and how in the dark mirror of the lives of people that suffer with addiction, we can trace the outlines of our own. Chapter 1 explains the mandala, the Buddhist wheel of life, which states that reality transcends 6 distinct realms, each representing aspects of human existence. In the lower realms, people are either driven by states of unbearable rage, basic survival instincts such as physical hunger and sexuality, or constantly searching for something outside of themselves for relief or fulfillment. That last one is also known as the realm of hungry ghosts and is sometimes referred to as the realm of addiction because with their small mouths and large, bloated but empty bellies, the hungry ghost can never be satisfied. One theory behind what keeps people in the death grip of addiction is that drugs have the power to make the painful tolerable and the humdrum worth living for. We should also consider that people's brain physiology develops alongside their life events, and that chronic substance use is the addict's attempt to escape from physical or emotional distress. That is to say that the pathways of the brain which register and feel physical pain also activate during the experience of emotional rejection. In fact, on brain scans, they light up in response to social ostracism just as they would to physical stimuli. And so the question is never why the addiction, but why the pain. Evidence suggests that the majority of addicts were exposed to some form of adverse childhood experience, such as abuse, neglect, violence, or abandonment, which directly shaped both the psychology and neurobiology in the brain. Therefore, the meaning of all addictions could be defined as the endeavour of controlling our life experiences with the help of external remedies. In Chapter 9, Dr Maté describes his personal struggle and addiction to collecting classical music as a desire that starts as a thought and rapidly transforms itself into a concrete object in his mind with a weight and a pull, creating a tension that is relieved only when he succumbs. He talks about addiction not as a solid entity, but as a subtle and extensive continuum, with its central and defining attributes present in all addicts, be this the workaholic at one end or the impoverished and criminalized crack fiend at the other. Addiction is self-centered and requires a specific outcome that feeds the ego. Without this, the person feels empty and deprived, similar to a black hole in which the more you offer, the more it demands. Addiction is a complex interaction between humans and their environment based on a blend of compulsive engagement with the substance or behavior, impaired control, persistence or relapse despite evidence of harm, and irritability or intense craving when the object or activity is not immediately available. This is due to the fact that all addictions, whether to drugs or behaviours, share the same circuits and chemicals in the brain. Chapter 12 expands on this by addressing the misconception that drug taking by itself will cause addiction, which in turn obscures our view of the addiction process, of which drugs are one possible object. Addiction is a human problem that resides in people, not the drug or the drug's capacity to produce physical effects. For example, less dominant monkeys who are stressed or isolated have been shown to be more likely to self-administer cocaine. The emotional isolation, powerlessness, and stress are exactly the same conditions that promote the neurobiology of addiction in human beings. Put it another way, drugs on their own do not make anyone into an addict any more than food can turn someone into a compulsive eater. For the addictive process to manifest, there has to be a pre-existing vulnerability, significant stress, and a drug with an addictive potential. Chapter 13 asks if the changes in the addicted brain are purely the consequence of drug use, or is the habitual user somehow susceptible before drug use begins, predisposed as a result of life experience or hereditary conditions. To answer this, we need to understand the role of dopamine, a chemical messenger that plays a key role in addiction. In a study involving rhesus monkeys, the number of dopamine receptors were found to be reduced in chronic cocaine users. Receptors help cells exchange messages with their environment. Cocaine and other stimulants greatly increase the amount of dopamine available to cells in essential brain centers. And because cocaine users have fewer than normal dopamine receptors, their brains are more likely to welcome external substances that would increase its dopamine supply. The study showed that monkeys that developed a higher propensity for cocaine self-administration had a lower number of dopamine receptors before ever having been exposed to the drug, suggesting that among rhesus monkeys, who by the way are considered to be excellent models of human addiction, some are more prone to the extremes of drug dependence than others. It also suggests that none of these substances could affect us unless they worked on natural processes in the brain that made use of the brain's innate chemical apparatus. In fact, the brain systems involved in addiction are among the key organizers and motivators of human behavior. The opioid system uses endorphins as its chemical messenger. Endorphin being a combination of two words meaning it originates from within and has a chemical composition that resembles morphine. Our endorphin levels increase when we expect relief from pain, even when administered with an inert substance, which is also known as the placebo effect. Anatomically, we register and feel pain in two different places. For example, physical pain registers in the thalamus, but the subjective impact or emotion is registered in the anterior cingulate cortex. When we experience physical pain, opiates such as endorphins help to reduce the emotional impact of pain registered in the cortex. In the case of an infant mammal, emotional pain can be used to alert us to the danger of separation from those we depend on. It does this by triggering infant behavior to bring the parent or caregiver back. Thus, the presence of a returning adult triggers the release of endorphins in the infant's brain. Conversely, that same pain is felt if a parent is physically present but emotionally detached, known clinically as proximal separation. Therefore, children who have not received the attentive presence of a parent are at greater risk of seeking satisfaction from external sources later in life. The incentive system uses dopamine as its chemical messenger to motivate survival behaviors such as foraging for food or water. It responds to reinforcement by increasing dopamine when our experience meets our expectation in an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine triggered by a previous experience incites consummatory behavior, which is why environmental cues associated with a drug such as people, places, situations and paraphernalia are all powerful triggers for repeated use and for relapse because they trigger a release of dopamine. All drugs work by locking into receptor sites on cell surfaces. Cocaine, for example, increases brain levels of dopamine by blocking it from being transported back into the nerve cells that released it, which in turn forces the user to seek more of an artificial high. Hence, being born with less dopamine receptors may predispose people to addictive behaviors. Addiction also disrupts the parts of the brain responsible for rational judgment and impulse control, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, which gives us the capacity to balance short-term objectives versus longer-term consequences in the process of decision-making. And so dysfunction in the cortex also helps to facilitate addictive behavior in an unconscious and automatic process known as salience attribution, where a person emotionally overvalues the drug and undervalues other concerns such as food, health, or relationships. Chapter 17 talks more about childhood brain development and predisposition to addictive tendencies as a result of the environment. In fact, it actually states that childhood brain development has the greatest impact on addiction, and that emphasis placed on genetics is an impediment to our understanding. Outside the relatively safe environment of the womb, our brains in progress are highly vulnerable to potential adverse situations or circumstances. In a process known as neural Darwinism, our developing brains select the neurons and synapses that help it adapt to its particular environment and discard the ones that are less helpful. Crucially, it's not bad stimulation, but a lack of sufficient good stimulation during this critical period that determines the organisation and functional states of the brain. For example, a child that was kept in a dark room and whose brain never received the information that being able to see was essential for survival would develop irreversible blindness as a result. What's true for blindness is also true for the opioid circuits of attachment and reward, the dopamine circuits of motivation, and the regulatory centers in the prefrontal cortex. This is to say that the emotional environment is responsible for the development of all major brain circuits associated with addiction. And since the brain governs mood, emotional self-control, and social behavior, we can expect that the neurological consequences of adverse experiences will lead to deficits in the personal and social lives of people who suffered in childhood, including a reduced capacity to anticipate consequences or to inhibit inappropriate self-destructive behaviors. Chapter 20 defines addiction as any repeated behavior, substance-related or not, in which a person feels compelled to persist regardless of its negative impact on their lives and the lives of others. It's based on a framework of compulsion, preoccupation, impaired control, persistence, relapse, and craving. It includes any activity, natural or artificial, that induces a feeling of increased motivation and rewards. For example, shopping, gambling, watching TV, or extreme sports will activate the same brain systems as drug addiction, which explains in part the reason why a natural and essential activity such as eating can become the target of faulty incentive reward circuits aided and abetted by deficient self-regulation. What this means is that the addiction process can change its form of expression without changing its nature. And so it's not the activity or object that defines addiction, but our relationship with whatever is the external focus of our attention and behavior. This is why rock bottom is different for everyone. But invariably, the end result of any addiction process is that we only deepen the vacuum in which a connection with the world is supposed to arise. Chapter 25 discusses the morality and evidence against the war on drugs, from how it disproportionately affects marginalized groups of people, and is based on the arbitrary principle that people may poison themselves with alcohol or cigarette-derived toxins, but those whose addiction is a narcotic are to be considered criminals. One school of thought is the assumption that the addict is free to choose not to be addicted, and that harsh social and legal measures will deter them. To better understand why this idea is flawed, we need to take a closer look at the concept of freedom. For example, in society, freedom is defined by our success in getting what we want, relative to the balance of power decided by race, class, and gender. Conversely, the psyche of freedom is the ability to opt for our long-term physical and spiritual well-being as opposed to our immediate urges. The power to choose only exists when our automatic mental mechanisms are subject to those brain systems that are able to maintain conscious awareness. Therefore, a person driven by unconscious forces and automatic brain mechanisms is only poorly able to exercise freedom of choice. Addiction can be understood as a spectrum upon which most humans exist, with enslavement to destructive habits on one end and total consciousness and non-attachment at the other. In light of this, we should praise and celebrate those who have managed to reform and may even find it useful to research the factors that help them, but should stop short of comparing one person's experience to another or judge those that fail, as no two brains or experiences are the same. Chapter 27 talks about some of the steps we might take towards a more progressive policy on drugs. This is summed up by a quote from Jiddu Krishnamurti, which states that action on any level without understanding will only breed conflict, and that the understanding of the relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. In the case of addiction, we should consider the social policy alongside the relationship between those that set it and those that are affected by it. Maté continues to outline additional steps for a more person-centered approach, all with a view to reducing the risk of infection, disease, transmission and overdoses, as well as people being less likely to turn to crime, violence or prostitution to fund habits. As he puts it, the harm reduction approach accepts that some people are too deeply enmeshed in substance dependence for any realistic cure under present circumstances. There has simply been too much pain in their lives and too little resources to help them. Chapter 29 onwards outlines several self-help strategies for persons affected by addiction and the people that support them. This includes the way we can leverage curiosity about life histories and self-perceptions to avoid imposing judgment, being aware of your own internal climate as a means to transcending automatic function of past conditioned brain circuits, the function of neuroplasticity and the ability of conscious attention to transform the physiological substrates of the brain, the freedom offered by sobriety versus the restraints of abstinence, and the power of acceptance amongst family, friends and caregivers, bearing in mind that until somebody is willing to take on the task of self-mastery, no one will be able to convince them to do so. At the same time, if we want to open up a healing space for others, we must first find it within ourselves. Chapter 34 covers the spiritual anchors of the addictive process, because in a state of spiritual poverty, we attach ourselves to whatever it is that desensitizes us to our dread. The drive to take from the outside that which arises within is where the addictive process starts. Hence the feeling of emptiness when we place a supreme value on selfish attainments. In other words, human beings cannot exist on bread alone. In summary, and in my opinion, there is something about the author's honesty and vulnerability that forces the reader to reflect on their own situation and life experience and really consider what it means to recognize somebody else's acute emotional pain as their own, in order that you can take on their perspective and accept them and their worldview unconditionally. The other thing that's quite profound is that the book leverages Gabor Maté's personal and medical experience alongside spiritual analogies to tell aspects of the same story, which is that addiction is a common process that can be expressed in many different ways. The way that it gets expressed in an individual is dependent to a large extent on factors that were outside of that person's control. Nobody is in a position to cast judgment, and it's in everyone's interest to be open-minded about the experiences and expressions of other people. Another prevalent theme is that addiction really is a societal problem. And just as society is multi-layered, so should the approach be to tackling addiction. This is to say that no single angle on its own, be it medical or legislative, can in and of itself be a panacea. But what we can do is turn the arrow inwards and lead by example when it comes to holding a safe space for others. Personally, I highly recommend this book, especially if you've ever wanted to learn more about addiction, either on a personal level, or you have a friend, family member or colleague that you wanted to help and you're looking for some guidance on where or how you might start the conversation. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out in your own time. In the interim, if you've gotten value from this video, please don't forget to subscribe for more content that's dedicated to helping you have more accessible conversations about mental health.